Yeah, I would say that it's brilliant questions, and also the one that it's really pretty hard to give, a solid answer in 1 or 2 minutes. I would say that probably something that we might want to start is actually recognizing exactly what you said, is that indeed the ownership or the memory gatekeeping function is now more and more actually delegated to the corporations and the algorithmic systems that they're designing. And it's just, I would say, pretty much the reality. I simply do not see how in 5 years situation would change, that the right to gatekeep the Holocaust-related information would fully go back to the museums. Because basically, in order to find a museum, if you actually do not know what Auschwitz is, you're going to the Google or you're going to the Bing. And then pretty much the corporation actually determines your entry point into this world of the Holocaust memory. And I would indeed say that probably we might actually start considering this situation and actually start about ways of actually trying of not necessarily regulating, but at least negotiating those entry points. Because otherwise we're running into a problem when pretty much it is corporations who are actually determining what the Holocaust memory looks like for the general audience. And I would say, and basically on what we are seeing right now, it is pretty problematic how they're regulating it. They're not necessarily doing what we might actually want them to do. So I totally agree. I would say that it's one of the essential questions of us to actually decide as a Holocaust educators and scholars, because we actually need to do something with this problem.
And some of these corporations have kind of said that they've made steps to ban. I think the word that's been often used is ban Holocaust Now on their sites, but actually what they've done is not recommend it. They've pushed it down right to the bottom of recommender algorithms. So if you want to find it, you go to the last page on Google, you go to the last page on YouTube. And any good researcher, and we teach our students to be inquisitive and go and look on the page 1000, because that could be interesting things to look at as media scholars, as historians. Even we want people to look at the stuff on the peripheral. And I think this tension is important. What's interesting, it seems to now be a tension between the corporations and the museums and the user, and the stories the users might have, and the kinds of people that Anna's talking about in her groups seem to be missing from this new conversation that's starting up, or debate that's starting up here. I don't know if anyone else would like to come in on that.
Yeah, I would just say, kind of from the perspective of the museum as well, because Twitter is now the platform where they do engage with their followers and the public more generally. I know for a fact that that Pavel will kind of search the hashtag Auschwitz and see what comes up, and then may kind of challenge or question sort of anything that comes up. So it's as wide an audience as possible. But also, what I would say is, about 2013 or 14 was when the media started picking up on people taking selfies. Obviously, that's quite a large component of social media now. People taking selfies at the camp and how disgusting it was and how obscene. And there hasn't been, up until now, I would say, there hasn't really been a discussion about that. It's really been presented as, this is a terrible thing. Why would anyone do that? And I think now we're starting to, the research has been done, and there's kind of a more, as I say, there's more of a back and forth about why some people might take selfies. So I have a friend, for example, who took a group to the museum, and she saw a group, an Orthodox Jewish family in front of one of the gas chambers taking a selfie. So again, straight away that kind of raises questions, because then it's not some sort of teenager on a kind of educational visit, for example. So there's so many different reasons that might happen. So I think it is gradually opening up from, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do, to actually involving that audience and involving the visitors, and them being able to say, well, hang on a minute, what about this? Have you considered this? And as I say, I think there is still a real question of ownership, and I think the museum is quite keen to take the reins still with that. But I would say it has, or is gradually starting to develop into something that's more of a conversation than just a kind of a monologue.
Eva and Stefania, in both your works, you drew attention to these kind of, on one hand, Stefania, the institutions talking to each other as a network, but then perhaps there's still a substantial number of them, but not all of the people that were talking to each other actually taking influence of each other. I know in the German context, there were certain organizations like Dachau, I think it was Buchenwald Neuengamme, or Bergen-Belsen rather, who were doing these kind of networked Zoom sessions between sites. So some places are obviously doing that. Eva, you picked up on, I've written it down here, you said that institutional and internet networks are not fit for social media cultures and not dynamic enough. Do you think part of that is about engaging users to have a kind of role in the creation of memory online?
I think it's just what Imogen just now said. If you have one person sitting behind the desk and doing all this for one institution or even more institutions, and then you block discussion by saying, well, this is not what we want, this is not what we need. I think that it's very obvious how should you find your community, your engaged community, should you find your filter bubble if you block discussion? And I think it has a lot to do with what Imogen said. It is one person, it's half a person basically usually doing social media, and even in the big institutions, it's not a full staff around who does that. I mean, you mentioned the German, let's say network of memorials and so on. They are doing more now, but also here, I've been told again and again, we don't really need this. So I wonder, do we not need it because it is tedious, it is a lot of work, it means to engage in discussions that we might not want to have, or we might not like to engage with, or is it also our responsibility to say, hey, here is this social media world, and somehow we should really engage here, and maybe we have to employ younger people. Maybe I'm not fit to do this in an appropriate way. No, I mean, honestly, it's more tedious than something that I do. I like Twitter, but everything else seems like a lot of effort that I need to put into this. But there's a lot of people who like Twitter, so why not let them do it, and why not give them some kind of freedom? But in the end, it comes back to this: we need money, so you need staff. You can't just let it. I think you cannot just let it flow without control, not control, but let's say moderation, some kind of moderation, some kind of somebody who, not only one person, several people who do try to, well, at least guide discussions, which also comes back to your question from before. If we let, if we let every memory come in, does it threaten historical truth? I think yes, definitely yes. That will be my resume from the last 2 years. The wisdom of the crowd was not very wise, I would say. That just came in. It was a lot of rubbish, just to make a long story short. So I think it comes back to, we need to engage, we need money to do this, and it has to open up boundaries.
Thank you. Anna, I think your work kind of goes from the other way round on this, and you're looking from the grassroots. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the different, I guess, power dynamics or the issues of authority and ownership in some of those spaces in comparison, because it seems to me that it's not museums that are having a particular visibility in these spaces.
No, I was thinking while you were talking now how strange it is, because like institutions are a very difficult terrain, I think, in many aspects of society, and of course also in Holocaust issues. But within a Facebook group, you see individuals, and it's a different, so this kind of gatekeeping and who owns the truth or who speaks the truth, or how institutions can save us from insecurity about the parallel truths. And you referred in the chat to this person saying that there is this fear of exposure, but on the other hand, in the other group, in the other Facebook group, when they have the description of the group, they really emphasize that they want to be a public group, they want to break with the culture of silence, and they want victims and survivors to have a voice which is heard, and not perpetrators, and not institutions which can be ideological or state-owned. And then there is a problem, and the individual cannot fight this voice. So for me, it's a big question how institutions can communicate with individuals about these issues, where the individuals have the individual traumatic life story, And then there comes an institution which is again ran by people, by individuals, but somehow those people in an institutional function, they don't get into dialogue with the other individual, but want to somehow frame the way these individuals can talk. And that framing can be also a bad influence or having a bad impact, the same as the crowd can have a voice which is not speaking the so-called historical truths, because there can be many historical truths. So this is my opinion on this issue.
Thank you, Anna. And I think that really draws attention to the complexity of multiplicity. And I love your final statement there that, you know, for every survivor and every victim, the experience of the Holocaust was different, and there will be shared points. And sometimes what happens when and I know I've spoken to survivors who have negotiate this, that there's a kind of a particular framing of how a particular institution may want the survivor narrative delivered. And so certain things are particularly picked out, which might not be the most meaningful moments in that particular person's memory, or things that are particularly kind of emotionally significant to them if they were allowed to give their kind of story freehand as such. And I guess it also opens up questions about the multiplicity of these other areas, that when we talk about institutions and corporations, we're also talking about human beings. And we're also talking about survivors who may have different ideologies about the past as well, and be living in different cultural contexts. You know, when we're talking about people at Google, it's people making decisions behind how to write the algorithms, which learning sets, if they're going to use machine learning at all, to base that on. And those were based on some really often problematic data if we go right to the early days of machine learning training sets. And I think Imogen's work points out, and Eva said, you have individuals, or half an individual, which is often very true, of doing the social media, and often people that aren't social media trained. And you know, do you have to make a compromise that you have someone who has less historical knowledge or less understanding of the Holocaust, but more knowledge of social media, or do you have teams? And I think Nicholas has just said in the chat about a whole conversation at an institution about whether a tweet should be liked, I think, or an Instagram post should be liked. Was it this particular one? And if we're doing that kind of micro managing in groups as an institution, you know, there have been new social media platforms appearing and going before someone's decided whether to like a Instagram post or not. Stefania, I wondered if you could come in about the that last thing you were talking about certain institutions being influenced by others. Is there a particular power dynamic there? Is it the big institution stuff that's being shared and their practices that are being copied, or is it a bit more mixed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And this is something we are thinking about because as you know, scholars tend to talk about a global Holocaust memory. So some unique way to approach the topic of Holocaust memory, of Holocaust knowledge, which has become European from one side and global from the other side. But one of the reasons we decided to select these two countries, Germany and Italy, is also because even though they belong to the same European culture, the same European identity, and the same kind of Holocaust memory and remembrance approach, we also expect to find some meaningful differences. Because the Holocaust memory is, yes, it's something that is becoming global, transversal, but it's also rooted on geographical, national, local history, as also Anna was showing in her research. So we expect to find meaningful differences in terms of what kind of content the different museums and memorials propose on their social media profiles, selection of topics, of themes that can be quite different from one country to the other.